Finally, I have a message for President Trump from, well, one Republican to another. This is a disaster, and you can still fix it. You made a promise to protect the LGBTQ community. Call me.
Let's start here. That is a man in a dress taking hormones. That is a man in a dress taking hormones. That is not a woman. And Bruce Jenner did not become a woman simply because he feels that he is a woman. He remains a man. I just want to set the record straight.
The only thing you have managed to set straight is that you are a vile person. I do not like Caitlyn Jenner, so much that I wish Trump would make her an honorary cis person just so she is no longer associated with the trans community, which in my own experience has near unanimously rejected her on political and social values. So I make no pretense that she's a good person. All she's doing here is acting seemingly dumbfounded over the fact that a truly ghastly presidential candidate who was backed by some of the worst people humankind has ever managed to produce and, during their ascension, managed to reinvigorate literal Nazis, emboldening them enough to return to the public sphere in mass, albeit under a number of misleading titles, that for some reason said candidate did something unsavory when they became president. But that fact does not excuse your own actions in being incredibly putrid surrounding Caitlyn being a woman, because you are stuck in a state of pure illiteracy when it comes to the science of biology and psychology, not to mention ethics and a general sense of humanity. Now, I doubt you'll give a crap, but I just wanted to note that you destroyed any and all opportunity for pleasantness in being such a devolved excuse for a person from the very start of your video.
But he is upset with President Trump because President Trump rescinded a ridiculous order, guidelines from the federal government that completely changed the meaning of sex, that biological sex in our laws, biological sex in Title IX, which was put in place in particular to protect women, girls in schools and to give them rights and develop their sports and things like that. No, where it says sex, that now means gender identity. So if you can't discriminate based on sex, that means you can't discriminate based on gender identity. So under the Department of Justice Obama guidelines that came in his last year in office, by the way, that potentially states could be penalized, could lose billions of dollars of funding if they didn't allow a 17-year-old boy who identifies as a girl to play on the girls' sports team and to share the girls' locker room and shower stalls and bathroom. It's this complete outrage and nothing less than outrage. And all the Trump order did was to push this back to the states and say, hey, work out something, hear me, that is in the best interest of everyone.
And as to be expected, your synopsis was complete and utter rubbish. Whilst Title IX talked about sex-based discrimination, it did not lay out the definition you asserted in any way, shape or form, which is why the interpretation of that law is being discussed. You see, language is not law, it's not natural, it's not organic. It's synthetically formed through mutual usage and understanding. Sex and gender are in many ways synonymous, even though people have attempted to separate the two as a way to create a fake mid-ground that really was never meant to be. You see, sex developed as a way to categorize features typically associated with a specific gender. So most men have X, therefore that's what makes a male, and most women have Y, therefore that's what makes a female. Over time, this was portrayed as being a strict dimorphism set in biology. The reality, meanwhile, is that this has never been the case. A pure male or pure female, if you were to take these qualities and apply them, does not exist. Why? Because of how our species evolved and how we develop in the womb. Everyone, regardless of gender, assigned or otherwise, starts out with the same basic structure in the womb with what could be termed both male and female structures. And we each still have many of these features to varying degrees present in our fully formed bodies. Most women still have a clitoris which is homogeneous to the glands. Most men still have nipples and breast tissue, and all of us have some level of the opposing hormone in our bloodstream. And this is just with the general population. There is a portion of our population making up about 2% of all live births which science refuses to assign either male or female because they take said variety to the extreme. These people come under the label of intersex, and their rights are in many ways intertwined with trans rights, which is why we so often talk about them together. Fact is, you rarely hear about them because current practice involves mutilating the child before they reach any age to make an informed decision of their own. Some intersex children are taught that they have cancer as they go under the knife just because the parents refuse to talk to them about being intersex. So when they eventually find out, this places a ton of stigma on them, and guidelines like those formed by Obama go a step in the right direction to opening activities they'd previously been excluded from, as well as to trans children. But what's important is that your idea of sex does not stand the slightest scientific scrutiny. There can be argued to be two general sets of clustering, but that does not then erase everyone else, and our language is in the period of developing in a way to handle that fact. Because that is what language does, including the language of science. Terms adapt and change dependent on usage and accuracy. Look at the original term for intersex, which is now completely stigmatizing, hermaphrodite. This started out referring to only a specific set of intersex characteristics, i.e. both male and female genitalia externally, but then grew to include all the other categories before being changed to intersex due to stigma. And that is why it was important for Obama to clarify the extent of Title IX, and it will now be more important than ever for the Supreme Court to make a ruling on the matter, now that Trump has declared it open season on transgender and intersex children, and you have stepped in and agreed with that, with the horrific pretense that this is to find some better ground when all your actions will really lead to is teen suicide. Their blood will be on your hands as well as the hands of anyone who voted for Trump, whether they like it or not.
You have one kid struggling. My heart goes out to the kid. My heart goes out to the family. A 6-year-old boy who believes he's a girl. From what I've read, numerous studies indicate that as high as 80% or even higher of kids like that, when they get past puberty, will no longer identify as the opposite sex.
This is pure misinformation, which is spread to dishonestly conclude that the brutalization of trans people is somehow justified. A decent portion of young people taken to gender clinics to find out whether or not they are in fact transgender turn out to not be, and thankfully, specialists have been able to spot the differences between those who persist and desist, so children who are not trans are not forced to go down the wrong path. Now, if the majority of people who, say, get an exam at a hospital turn out not to have a problem and are therefore sent home without further help, is the conclusion then that nobody has a problem? Because that's all that's happening in this statistic you have mentioned. Well-intentioned people such as parents or school counselors send children off to be analyzed. The specialists come back and say the child doesn't need further support because they're not identifying as the other gender. Now, the main cause of this is parents and untrained specialists confusing children playing outside of what they consider the typical gendered behavior for a boy or a girl, something which is absolute rubbish, being conflated with identifying as the opposite gender. Specialists found that these children who are simply exploring beyond what parents consider to be male or female behavior, whilst they may express the desire to be the other gender, in no way identify as such. Meanwhile, actual trans children very strongly identify as their gender. The parents' initial ignorance to the complexities of human psychology when they take them to said clinic to find out the best option for their child is not an argument against the specialists who say the majority of these children are not trans, so do not worry, they do not need further support. How you fall otherwise beyond the desire to create a dishonest portrayal of matters is beyond me.
But right now, the kid's struggling. Our heart goes out to him. But you don't turn the world upside down for that kid. You don't put the 6-year-old boy who thinks he's a girl into the girls' bathroom with other 6-year-old girls and confuse them. I thought Johnny was a boy. Now Johnny is Jane. I don't understand. They don't need tolerance. They need to be told boys are boys and girls are girls, and Johnny is confused, so be nice to Johnny, but he's confused.
So your number one plan is to line up children not only for bullying by other students, but also adults such as yourself, as you demonstrated at the very start of the video. Fact is, there is not 1 ounce of evidence to date that shows children at any age are confused by trans people, with the caveat here of so long as they don't have a person such as yourself lie to them about what being trans means. If you lie, then of course they become confused. That's on you, not trans people. What you are pushing for here is reparative therapy, where a child who is trans is pressured to conform to your pseudo-scientific notions of what it means to be a man or a woman. Here's a fun fact. Psychiatric, pediatric, and general human rights organizations find such actions to rather simply be torture. It's a course of action that is sure set on destroying the child by crippling their sense of self-worth, as well as trust in the people around them, as the very people who should be protecting them are in fact pushing the vile narrative that will shove them over the edge. Half of young trans people have attempted suicide in both the US and the UK, far higher than the cisgender population, i.e. the non-trans population. And your way is part of that problem in rejecting any LGBT+ child, as the science bears out. Meanwhile, allowing children to socially transition completely removes any increase in depression and anxiety down to the same levels of a cisgender control, so non-transgender children, reduces it to the same levels. Your way takes lives. Our way saves them. So don't pretend that your heart bleeds when you support the person practically signing the death warrant for a good number of trans people. Don't patronize us with your feigned concern.
Let the school have a place if you need, just like you have special facilities for handicap. This is some type of handicap, mental, emotional, some kind of handicap, all right? We're not talking about someone that's biologically intersex. That's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of those who identify as transgender. We're talking about people who are biologically, chromosomally males or females and who simply believe they're the opposite of what they are. So, just like you have a bathroom for handicap, you'd have special accommodations for someone who's blind, someone who struggles with being transgender, they have gender identity issues, then do your best to accommodate them, but don't impose that on the rest of the students.
I don't know where to begin except with a massive fuck you on the demand to bring back separate but equal. The reason people with disabilities have special provisions is because they're a requirement to function, not you find them icky and therefore they need to go and be in the modern day leper colony, like you're actually pushing for. First of all, being trans is not a mental disorder in any way, shape or form. Trans people can suffer from gender dysphoria, i.e. depression and anxiety and other psychological problems brought about by societal hostility in socially transitioning and denial of medical access. But as I've just shown you, this dysphoria can be completely alleviated in allowing a child to socially transition, and yet they are still trans. Being trans and gender dysphoria are not synonymous, any more than being a fish and gill rot are synonymous. Which brings me on to my second point, that is, to function, they need to be allowed to socially transition. That's what the science shows on the matter, regardless of your protest. What you are doing is seeking to punish children and destroy their lives because their very existence is wrong in your eyes, and I find that completely disgraceful. No child has been harmed by allowing trans children to socially transition. Want to prove me wrong? Supply evidence like I have. Cite a journal article. Make a case. Don't rely on scientifically illiterate fear-mongering, which is completely void of the most basic level of human decency. That's without even acknowledging that you noted that you're wrong on sex with the existence of intersex people, so really I don't know what to expect in the next segment.
CNN Democrat Chris Cuomo took issue with this and said via Twitter, say about a girl who had a problem with this, I wonder if she is the problem or her overprotective and intolerant dad. Teach tolerance. Tolerance is a two-way street, Mr. Cuomo. Tolerance is a two-way street. How about all the other kids who are negatively affected? How about the many girls who have been traumatized by the presence of a boy in their bathroom, in their locker room, next to them in a shower stall? How about all of those? How about the cases that are going to court over this, over girls being traumatized? Isn't tolerance a two-way street? And since when is it tolerant to tell a girl you just have to get used to seeing a boy's private parts in your locker room? Since when is that tolerant? As others have said, that used to be indecent exposure.
Here's something that brings this entire argument crumbling down. 49% of British people aged between 18 and 24 are not heterosexual, and yet there's not a hitch in changing rooms. There hasn't been a mass epidemic in sexual assaults or rapes or anything like that. They've been perfectly fine. Why? Because children aren't sexualizing themselves at a young age. You are sexualizing these children. You are thinking about the genitals of young children and asking, how can anyone see these as anything but sexually provocative? That is what seems to be your line of thought. As for children apparently traumatized, can you actually demonstrate any cases where parents haven't either lied to them or taken the school to court because the parents have a problem? Can you also demonstrate how this is any different to white people claiming that they were being traumatized by black people being allowed into, quote, white spaces? I can demonstrate that your actions support the death of trans children and trans teenagers. Not only can I reference case studies, but actual research papers that show this fact, and I have done so time and time again. I can also bring up nudist colonies who clearly demonstrate that nudity is not innately sexual on a mass scale. Not to mention centuries of fine art and statues which were once on public display. That's without forgetting the facts of farm life that used to be so prevalent. Don't like what I'm saying? Stop sexualizing our children to abuse a small portion of them, and I'll stop. The fact is, I know it's going to be hard for society to stop sexualizing children thanks to people such as yourself. But I don't mind stalls, so long as they're for everyone. I remember my community centre had unisex changing rooms. They had, like cubicles, stalls in which you changed, and then you had lockers which you could access. There were also family stalls for people who had little children, etc. So I don't mind that, but you don't get to treat trans people as a modern day leper. And here's an extra thing to consider. The reason disabled toilets exist is because they don't know if the disabled child is going to be male or female. Therefore, if you make unisex changing rooms and toilets, that all changes. You can move the disabled provisions into these unisex spaces, just having designated ones with disability, so they can still be within the same room and use some of the same stuff, and they're not so ostracized as well. So it's not just trans and intersex people who seek to benefit, but also potentially disabled people in being less ostracized. So the argument you presented there completely collapses as well. So yeah, you can read these studies, take issue with them, and challenge what I say, but what you cannot deny is the scientific consensus on the matter, nor can you pretend that your support for dead trans children is based out of simple ignorance. You decided to attack these children. You should know better.
Well, it gets even crazier when this simply becomes whatever you think it is. That if I think I'm a girl, I'm a girl. If I think I'm Chinese, I'm Chinese. If I think I'm 7 foot tall, I'm 7 foot tall. If I think I'm a child, I'm a child. Well, why not? If I think I'm black, then I'm black. If gender is what I perceive it to be, then why not other things? Well, this comes up in a dialogue between Tucker Carlson on Fox News and Zach Petkonis from the Democratic National Committee, a senior advisor. Listen to this enlightening dialogue.
The core question is what constitutes male and female. And the implication of these guidelines that Obama put in place is that a man is someone who says he's a man, and a woman is someone who says she's a woman. You get to decide your gender. There's no biological anchor to sex anymore. It's all determined by the individual. So my obvious question for you is, how do I know if a person's male or female? Is there some other absolute standard that people have to meet to be male or female, other than what they say?
One's gender identity is enough to show what gender they are. And so if you're confused about that, I mean, I leave that, to your level of enlightenment and
No, it's not about enlightenment. It's not about more.
Enlightenment. Oh, it's enlightened when Bruce Jenner tells us that he's a woman, and the enlightened ones now refer to him as she. That's enlightenment. Perhaps it was enlightenment when Rachel Dolezal said she was black. Maybe we should refer to her as a black woman now, because after all, that's her identity. If you can be transgender, why not transracial? Why not transspecies? It goes on and on. This is not about enlightenment. This is about rational thinking.
You have absolutely no claim to rational thinking whatsoever. The fact is, science has investigated this phenomena and recognized it as legitimate. Why? Because every social interaction we have surrounding gender involves core identity. That's how the language and understanding developed. It then got bastardized by a woefully poor understanding of both biology and psychology. As noted, there is no strict binary when it comes to sex. There is some general clustering, but even then we have these extreme cases connecting everything in between. And that connection exists even though there has historically been pressure to sterilize intersex individuals without their consent. So even with medical war declared, 2% is a persistent number, and that's only the most extreme examples, which ignores the fact that everyone has to some degree what we would class physiological androgyny. Your idea of reality is so small that, yes, to broaden the ability to understand things on a greater scale through the development of better language and newer scientific models is what I would call an enlightenment. The fact that you have to recycle the same old slippery slope fallacy of, well, if a man can marry another man, why can't I marry a dog, into, well, if you identify as gender X, why can't I identify as an attack helicopter, as I so often hear, just proves to me that you don't have a leg to stand on, period.
And then to add insult to injury, listen to this. California, the state of California, has created its own travel ban. And they said this: if you are in a public university as a student, then you are not allowed to have state-funded travel to, quote, anti-LGBT states. That would include states like Mississippi and North Carolina and some others. Now, listen to this statement. Inclusivity and diversity are fundamental values of the California State University. Therefore, we are being discriminatory against all those who don't see the world the way we do. Therefore, we are being exclusive, and we are being the opposite of diversity. It's my way or the highway. If you don't agree with us, you're out. You can't use state funds to travel to any of these states. This is ridiculous. This is what would happen in some kind of dictatorship. This is the opposite of being tolerant, inclusive, diverse. But what else do you expect when the whole world is turned upside down?
Well, perhaps a Christian could utilize a reasoned evidence-based argument for once, but since no actual upside-down world exists, I guess that would just have to remain a hypothetical. This just comes back to the standard of fighting bigotry is not bigotry. If you are violating not only a person's civil rights but also their human rights in utilizing reparative therapy, which is akin to torture, what do you honestly expect? Do you expect people who actually give a damn about the well-being of students to just roll over and let people get hurt, or do you expect them to make a stand? A state is not a person having their rights violated. Trans people, on the other hand, are. Actual people get protections under the law. The same is not true for the pockets of those signing away the rights of others. The latter has nothing to do with tolerance besides standing up for it. Here's a fact: your beliefs do not get to dictate another person's rights. That's a very simple idea dating back to the foundation of your country. a person's religion cannot be imposed to dictate the life of another person. The separation of church and state is as much at the center of this case as it is your typical case of teacher pushing Christianity on students on state-funded time. But in all, I think I have left each and every point you have attempted to make throughout this video in utter ruin. As I have noted before, in that when it comes to Christians arguing against same-sex couples on the basis that it will lead to paedophilia and bestiality, this argument only reveals that the Christian lacks any and all understanding of informed consent. I now have to note the comparable example with trans people. That's to say, in the way that you ignore how half of all children will turn out to not be entirely heterosexual and therefore just as likely to check out one another at such a young age as someone from the other changing room, introducing a trans child into the equation doesn't change that dynamic beyond your assertion that said child is nothing more than a sexual object reduced to their genitalia, but not only reduced to said genitalia, but a single function of said genitalia. That's like saying the hands are innately sexual because they can be used in sex, or that the mouth is innately sexual because it can be used in sex. All this actually shows me is that you have seriously spent time sexualizing these children in order to launch an attack on them, once again revealing far more about your moral depravity, not theirs. Not only do you ignore LGBT children, you also ignore the countless examples I can bring up to show how nudity is not innately sexual, but is sexualized more and more by creeps such as yourself. Feet can also be sexualized in some cultures which practice foot binding, i.e., where women have their feet smashed by rocks, crushed, and then are bound tightly to make them smaller and smaller. That sexualizes them. But they're not innately sexual any more than the genitals of a young child. And I'm going to keep saying that until you stop hurting trans children and trans people in general. There are a few things which I'd just like to add here at the end of this video. The first is a massive thank you to everyone who has ever donated to me via Patreon. Your fantastic support has given me the ability to keep this channel going, and I hope to continue producing content in the years to come. Secondly, I would like to thank anyone who has ever interacted with this channel. Your shares, likes and dislikes, as well as your comments of both approval and disapproval, have ensured constant feedback allowing me to improve my work. Last of all, I would like to express my desire that you treat any of the people displayed throughout the video with respect. Whilst it is true that ideas do not demand respect, and there are many in fact which deserve reprehension, we must be careful on how we tackle said ideas in ensuring we are not simply targeting the person. In short, be the compassionate side of reason. So take care, and I'll see you next time.